everybody. The name of today's lecture is East and West, A Tale of Two Churches. We are going to look at kind of the development of these two different traditions. We're going to spend a little bit more time in the West today. We are going to look at the Eastern Church, especially under Justinian and Theodora. And then we have another week where I really go in depth on Eastern Orthodoxy. But we're going to talk about how things are already starting to divide in the early church. Okay, so let's go. By the 5th century, we are seeing this divide between East and West very clearly. There are two distinct church traditions emerging simultaneously, all right? Big picture things like authority and leadership. Obviously, in the West, you have the Bishop of Rome kind of asserting superiority over other bishops, and that is not the case in the East. However, there are also major cultural, not to mention linguistic differences from the start between these two kind of church regions, all right? And I would argue that these differences are exacerbated once Antioch and Alexandria are conquered by Islamic forces. And so you just have these two powerful bishopships, one in the West, one in the East. And it starts to look a little bit more adversarial at that point, all right? So the vast majority of Western churches were Catholic, and they look to the Bishop of Rome for authority. All right. Cyprian of Carthage argued that Jesus had first given authority to Peter, and Peter's priority among the apostles was a symbol of unity in leadership for the entire church. Okay. It is kind of an easy connection between Peter and the Bishop of Rome, who largely was considered the heir of Peter, all right, even from the early days. Okay, so this idea of kind of like Peter, you can see up on the screen, I have Jesus handing the keys of heaven to Peter in this image. All right, this idea is really growing in the West while it's diminishing in the East. All right. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the Pope's rise in power and influence in late antiquity. All right. Perhaps ironically, the increase in authority and influence of the bishop in Rome is largely due to the decline in secular Europe in late antiquity. Okay. Well, in the Eastern Empire, the emperors and empresses continue to have firm control over their realm, mostly. The Western Empire is starting to crumble in late antiquity, and you see, as we will go into the early Middle Ages, how the Pope's influence really increases then, okay? So when Constantine moves his capital, it created an economic downturn in Rome. And this is followed up by a political vacuum in the West. So immediately, even in like the 300s, all right, we're seeing some major shifts in kind of the status of the Western part of the empire, okay? And then, we're going to see lots of invasions. And the West is sort of in a political crisis while things continue to be strong politically in the East, all right? So first, after Constantine moves the official capital to Constantinople, the capital in the West then moves to Milan and then Ravenna. And then by the year 400, emperors hardly ever even visited Rome. Okay. Incompetency in the government left the churches largely responsible for matters that the state had once taken care of. All right, let's talk a little bit about the invasions. The Visigoths in the 390s carried out a number of attacks in the Balkans and in Greece. And in 408, they reached Rome, and they were paid a ransom to leave. In 410, they returned and attacked the city, and then they stayed. All right. The Huns are another group that came in. In 451, Attila launched a series of raids through Gaul, which is now kind of roughly France and northern Italy. In 451, he reached central Italy before Pope Leo negotiated with him to turn away. All right, so here you have a moment where the Pope is acting in a very political capacity. All right, Attila died the next year, thus sparing Rome from any further attacks from the Huns. And then finally, the Vandals, in 429, they landed in North Africa, and over the next decade, they gained control over the region. They ransacked cities, sold inhabitants off into slavery, and destroyed churches. In 440, they established an independent kingdom that lasted for about 100 years. And in 455, they advanced on Rome, but once again, it was Pope Leo, who negotiated, and the Vandals were allowed to take anything from the city as long as they didn't harm residents. All right, so you're seeing just a series of invasions, all right? What's kind of interesting, though, is you have these groups sort of integrating into the empire in a sense, but of course simultaneously changing the empire because of their presence, all right? The Visigoths became very Latinized and ended up with an independent kingdom in Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula. They were, interestingly enough, Arian Christians, though this difference is becoming less apparent as time goes on. By 475, the northern Roman border had basically collapsed. The Germanic tribes, the Saxons and the Angles, and all these groups were here to stay. All right, we're getting kind of a mixing of cultures at this point. All right, and by the opening of the 6th century, it was the German kings ruling in the West. The emperors were kind of old and gone. Like occasionally there would still be some interaction, but that old Roman order is essentially gone, okay? There's no longer this emperor in the West to uphold church decisions or councils. The church wasn't receiving money from the government anymore. Therefore, churches and monasteries needed to look for new sources of income, mainly private donations. Okay, so that gives you a little idea of context and what's going on in the West, especially politically. Okay, so here let's look at a major figure, Ambrose of Milan. All right, he was born in 339. He died in 379. He was the governor of Milan and a catechumen, so he was in the process of learning how to be a Christian and in the process of converting when he was appointed bishop of the city. Yes, he was not even a baptized Christian when he was appointed bishop. How did this happen? All right, let's talk a little bit about this. All right. So the previous bishop of Milan had died, and he had been appointed by an Arian emperor. Okay, remember we had some Arian emperors in there. Christianity was kind of a little bit of a crisis dealing with the whole Arian issue. Okay, so this Arian bishop died, and there was significant unrest in the process of appointing a new one. All right, obviously Arian Christians and Trinitarian Christians, each one their side represented in the bishopship. Okay. Ambrose, as political leader of the city, went to kind of calm the people when the crowd started chanting, "Ambrose Bishop, Ambrose Bishop." All right. He tried to dissuade the people. When that didn't work, he tried to escape the city. Finally, it became very clear that the emperor, who was Theodosius in the east and still had some limited influence over Western Christianity, would be very displeased if Ambrose ran off. So he accepted his fate. All right. So once again, we have a leader who did not want this position, but it was given to him. Okay. So he was baptized and made bishop all within 8 days in the year 373. I cannot even imagine. Okay. So while he did not want this position, he was very determined to do a good job once he had it. He took to the study of theology and eventually became one of the premier theologians in the West. He translated much of the Cappadocians' writing into Latin because they wrote in Greek. He did baptize Augustine, but it appears they did not have a particularly close relationship, though obviously he was influential in Augustine's conversion. There's actually kind of a funny part in Augustine's Confessions where Augustine essentially says that Ambrose was really too busy to bother to meet with him and seemed kind of unimpressed with him. So it's kind of a funny part. All right. Ambrose had an occasionally contentious relationship with the Emperor Theodosius. In one case, Theodosius ordered a group of Christians to rebuild a synagogue that they had burned. Ambrose protested against this, saying that the emperor had no right to force Christians to do this. This was a pretty unfortunate precedent to set. But in another conflict, Ambrose clearly sat on the side of right. There had been a big riot, and Theodosius, wanting to make an example, sent troops into the city and slaughtered about 7,000 of his own citizens, and Ambrose refused to let the emperor take communion until he confessed to his wrongdoing. Eventually, the emperor did relent. And also decreed that there would be a 30-day waiting period between an order of execution and when a person would be killed. Okay. So that is also kind of an interesting precedent. And what you see with Ambrose is kind of an asserting a political or a religious authority over the emperor in the West that you do not really see in the East. And that is an important thing to think about. All right, let's talk a little bit about Augustine, and then I'll wrap up this particular video. All right, he is such a huge figure in Western Christianity. We need to spend a little time with him. In fact, I used to assign Augustine's Confessions for this class. I opted not to, but you do have some of his writings in your reader. All right, so Augustine was born in 354 in North Africa, in this what is now Algeria. His mother, Monica, who's a canonized saint, was a Christian, and she prayed ceaselessly for her son. Okay, his father was not a Christian until much later in life. Augustine was a very bright child, and his parents spent quite a bit of money educating him. His family was pretty well-to-do, though they were not like really elite. So it was a bit of a hardship to get him the quality of education that they actually did. All right. Augustine ended up teaching rhetoric in Carthage, and then in 383 he went to Milan to teach rhetoric. Okay, and at this point Milan is kind of essentially functioning as the de facto capital of the West. So this is really a place where he can make his career. Okay. That is, of course, where he met Ambrose of Milan, too. His mother went with him and kind of concerns herself with the whole affair. All right. Now, I'm sure some of you have read Augustine's Confessions. This is probably the most famous conversion story in Christian history. It's got to be up there if it's not the most famous one. All right. And Augustine is pretty famous for being a sinner who later committed his life to Christianity. Okay. He was a bit of a seeker in his early days. First, he became a Manichaean. He was kind of at that hero level. Okay, and he had a long-term mistress and one child. All right, I want to take note of this because people often refer to this as like a really sinful relationship, but that's really not exactly what's going on here. It was actually a monogamous long-term relationship between Augustine and this woman that we actually don't even know what her name was. However, they were of unequal social classes. All right, Augustine was of like a higher rank than she was. So Augustine was expected to eventually marry an heiress of some sort. And so he spent, over a decade with this woman, kind of biding his time until a marriage to an heiress could be arranged. Okay. Eventually his mother does arrange such a marriage. He broke things off with the mother of his child. She goes into a convent somewhere. He takes their son, though his son dies as a teenager as well. But then he decides to refuse to marry at all because at this point he has decided that he is going to commit himself to the church. And he thinks the best way to do this is by being celibate, even though there were priests who had wives and children at this time. Okay, so it was in Milan that he converted under the influence of Ambrose, kind of. Augustine finally embraces Christianity and accepts baptism. One of Augustine's real issues was that he didn't think Christianity was intellectual enough, and one of the ways that Ambrose really influenced him was by showing him, that you could be this premier scholar and a Christian. Okay. Augustine was ordained a priest in Hippo, and then eventually he became bishop of the city. I think he probably desired kind of a quiet life of contemplation and study, but he lived at a really hard time in history, and he was drawn into a series of controversies. He became deeply, deeply involved in the Donatist controversy, which we talked about earlier in the semester. He was adamant that the actions of a priest had no bearing on their ability to administer the sacraments. All right, he wrote quite a bit on that. He was also really involved in the Pelagius controversy as well, and some of your readings have to do with this. Pelagius was a monk who preached much about good works, and Augustine was adamant about our depraved nature. Okay, he is credited with establishing the doctrine of original sin, which is actually really not a thing in Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay. In fact, I was reading a book by an Orthodox theologian who described Augustine as the point where everything goes wrong in the West, all right? So they actually have some real opinions on that sometimes, all right? And both Catholics and Protestants really value Augustine and his theology. Though kind of in different ways. But I want to at least make note that Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. And when you get to history too, you are going to see the influence that Augustine has on Luther. All right. I think I've gone on enough about Augustine for right now, and I'm going to wrap up this video. Okay, thanks everybody.